I work, for example, with a woman who's a 18th century scholar, and her name is Susan Glover from Laurentian University, and she's retired, and so her passion project is going into the archives in Toronto every day, and she's come up with, over 200 names of Indigenous writers from before 1870, where most people don't even appreciate that there's writing. A quite famous figure, the first author, Indigenous author of a book-length work in Canada was in 1847, George Copway. And even though I know that when I took courses, there were focuses on sort of writing by British transplants, Susanna Moodie or Catherine Partrail. At the same time, George Copway was writing, even in pretty much the same area of Canada. And yet, while English students today know Susanna Moodie's name, very few still have actually read George Copway. So I feel as though I still have some work to do in trying to bring write courses or encourage students to read that, or to maybe help publish a new edition of the book, that kind of thing. But there's certainly that has been the same with several other authors. I just haven't had time maybe to fulfill everything that I've wanted to do. There's a Cree author who was born in 1885 and he passed in 1961. His name was Edward Ahenakew. He was an Anglican minister. And while people know about his Cree translations, or he worked with anthropologists to tell Cree stories, he also wrote a romance novel. He wrote several short stories. They haven't been published yet. I've actually read them in the archives. But the family is just cautious about letting his material out just yet, and they will, I'm confident. But I know from also reading the archives that he wanted to be thought of as a writer. This is a dream that he had, and he was part of a writers' community in the 1920s. He tried to get Ryerson interested in one of his manuscripts, and nothing really came to be. But he's not the only one, There's, for example, a more contemporary example would be the Tanaka Secwepemc writer, Vera Manuel. So it was actually her sister and her good friend Joanne Arnott, so Emmeline Manuel and Joanne Arnott, who inspired my colleague and friend Michelle Kupal and I to kind of work together as a foursome, because Joanne was collecting all these little poems that Vera had written here and there, and Michelle and I were interested in plays that had either fallen out of publication or some have never been published. And then suddenly, in that kind of collaboration, Joanne went up to see Emmeline in near Cranbrook, and in Emmeline's dresser drawer, she kept several unpublished short stories that were just perfect. I'm not joking, absolutely perfectly written, and from the 1980s, and so late 1980s. They just had some maybe comments by maybe a creative writing teacher, but Emmeline had saved it for her sister, and Vera had never been able to get things published. And so we were able to work together, and in 2019, the book Honoring the Strength of Indian Women has come out, and that is really, go in and read the poetry, go in and read the short stories, but the plays. But the first thing you should do is open up the middle and read those short stories, because they're absolute finds. In our collection, because it takes time to bring these things together, there's a half-written novel by Vera Manuel that has never been published yet, where she has sort of go-go dancers. It's sort of from the 1960s, and Emmeline was telling me that she and Vera, as young girls, left Chilliwack and went down and lived in California for a while, and they were beautiful and dramatic and theatrical, and clearly liked the opportunities to go dance. So I feel sometimes like I have my office is filled with files of like diamonds and rubies. I mean, you know, like there's precious things, but you need time and you need the consent of the family and the vision of the family. There's no way we want to replicate the abuses of the past. So it was very common for academics, so non-Indigenous academics, to rush in and publish and edit as they wished any Indigenous text. And so in this time period, I think you have to be extra sensitive to the fact that most of these families have already seen, bad editing and bad publishing. And so you don't want to add to that. The two pieces that Edward Ahenakew had published after his passing was in a book called Voices of the Plains Cree, and half of it was stories he took with an interview with Chief Thunderchild, but the other half is called Old Kayam, and I have the originals of in his handwriting, and I have the version that Ruth Buck edited, and it's clear she took out material. Like he, as a Anglican minister and as a leader, criticized residential schools very generously. Like he wasn't trying to make political critique. He was trying to say, let's change this. Like, the sanitary conditions are terrible. Children, are going to die, and they did because of it. And the editor felt, I don't know, she's very religious and didn't want that bad press, and it wasn't a time period when people criticized residential schools, and so and we're just talking about the 70s. He wrote this in the 20s, and so it really does need to be reissued so that people today can understand how what he saw was clear 100 years ago. Mike Mountain Horse is a Blackfoot writer who I would love to see his work be reissued because it was also edited after his passing, and so was Joseph Dion's, and so he's a Cree writer, and just being able to go back with what we know now can help freshen, and it makes you realize how radical and cutting edge these writers were, whereas they sometimes were published at a time that didn't fully appreciate the history of Indigenous people in Canada, and sometimes wanted to sentimentalize Indigenous writing, whereas I think right now we want to hear their voices, and so I love that part of my job. It's really great.